First section we're going to talk about is the Great Awakening. This is what we covered last Friday. In this picture actually is supposed to be George Whitefield or Whitfield. He is a preacher. He is a young preacher and he's very dynamic. So when we're talking about the Great Awakening, we're actually talking about religion. And as mentioned in class, even though we're talking about colonial America we'll just say is from 1600 to 1775. Actually, let's go 1600 to 1780. We're still talking about, we're no longer talking about how strict the Puritans were. Because by about the 1700s, people are not going to church quite as often. They're a little bit more liberal as compared to the conservative Puritans we talked about and the witch trials and things like that. So the Great Awakening is this call for a return to religion. Many people live in the frontier, they're not going to church, or many people are having easier lives, so they're not going to church as much. And so there is this religious revival. And it happens because if you look at the picture, these preachers, such as George Whitefield and John Edwards, travel around throughout the colonies, the British colonies, and they preach to people and they inspire people to change and to come back to the church. And once they come back to the church, they want to change society. Um, while John Edwards and George Whitefield are traveling around, they're working with a different population than it was here in the 1600s, the first people in Jamestown or the Plymouth colony. Population has skyrocketed in 70 years. You have people migrating in, and you also have families that are growing and getting bigger, and children are living to adulthood as compared to in Europe. The infant mortality rate was much higher. So the other thing is that food is a little more abundant and disease is not as rampant as it is in European cities. So starting with the Great Awakening, we're going to say it's the 1720s to the 1740s. This is considered the first Great Awakening, not the second. The second Great Awakening starts about 100 years later in the 1800s. So if you're ever researching it, this is the first Great Awakening. It's a revival of intense religious expression in the colonies, telling people you are all sinners, you need to come back to the church. And it also, the other big thing is they talk about is equality in the eyes of God. That's women and men. And so what ends up happening is our founding fathers will start questioning if the English colonists are truly equal in the eyes of the British Empire. So if we're all equal in the eyes of God, why aren't we equal in the eyes of the British Empire? Great Awakening also calls for more social change and education, an increase in education. So once they come back, once many of the colonists come back to the church or enter the church for the first time, they start looking about how can we change society? How can we make this a better place to live in? So this is one of the key figures I've mentioned. This is John Edwards. He's big. He preached fire and brimstone, which means he was talking about heaven and hell and, you know, how you're a sinner and all this bad stuff. He's very famous for his speech, which I believe is sinners in the hands of a fiery devil or something like that. I'll actually put it on the blog in case you want to look at it. It's a very long speech. He is a reverend. He travels around. He's not Catholic, just so you know. He is a reverend, and he's traveling around and gets people to listen to him. Many people like him. Some of the older churchgoers don't necessarily like John Edwards or George Whitefield, who we'll talk about next. But the younger people really do like them. There's something about the fieriness. There's something about the passion of John Edwards that really sparks an interest in a younger population that causes them to go to the church. And then, like I said, this will lead to social change. The reason why we talk about the Great Awakening is because a lot of the stuff that's happening in the 1720s, 30s, and 40s will lead to the American Revolutionary War. He actually will become president of Princeton. Just so you know, Princeton started off as a seminary school. That means a place to train priests and clergy members where you went and studied the Bible. And so obviously him being a reverend is a good fit. Clearly Princeton is not just a seminary school today. So fire and brimstone, just looking at the picture, it's all about hell. The dangers of hell, you know, how we're sinners, things like that. The big focus. All right, this is the other person we're going to mention briefly, and he was from the video as well. George Whitefield or Whitefield, however you want to say it. He apparently caused mass hysteria in the ladies. He was young. And apparently, he was incredibly attractive. He was also known to not write any of his sermons down, would just kind of get up there and wing it for an hour, and people loved him. Ladies and men would like break down in hysteria and tears and cry in his presence because whatever he said was so incredibly moving. So he would take a passage from the Bible and then just go on a tangent about whatever his sermon was going to be of that day. So you may not think he's handsome, but apparently he was the handsome dish. So the outcome of the Great Awakening, why is this important? Because we're getting rid of the idea of the Salem witch trials. That's a thing in the past. We don't do that anymore. Religious groups don't do that anymore. You have more religious groups splitting up. So instead of just groups like the Puritans or Protestants, you're going to now start having more groups such as Baptist and Presbyterian and things like that. So you will start seeing more of a divide between the different Christian branches. Americans question authority. Once again, it goes back to that idea, if we're all equal in the eyes of God, why aren't we equal here on earth? And there's a heavier focus on education, like I said, which will lead into the Enlightenment movement and secularism, which is basically, it does not involve the church. So it's calling for a bit of a separation between church and state, or church and government. So when the Massachusetts government was run by John Winthrop, or the Massachusetts colony was originally run by John Winthrop, who was also the religious figure, they're not doing that anymore. They're trying not to mix their religion and government, even though they want their government officials to be religious figures. And then we'll move on to the Enlightenment.